Ah là là, retour dans le passé, mesdames et messieurs. Alors oui, euh, de base on devait être sur de le grille. Sauf que finalement j'ai décidé d'aller sur des rester. Pourquoi? C'est simplement parce que j'ai regardé les dates de sortie du jeu. Alors je peux même, je crois que je les ai laissés quelque part, je crois. Si je me trompe pas. Oui. Non, c'est pas là. C'est là. En gros, Derester et Erika ont 2 mois de plus que de le Grey in Rise of the Light et Drowning. Donc en fait, je me dis que ça n'avait pas beaucoup de sens que de faire passer d'abord Dulgrey, Drowning, tout ça, sans aucune raison exacte. En fait, il n'y a pas vraiment de raison de pourquoi ils étaient passés avant. Alors ça, j'ai réfléchi, je me suis dit, bon, en vrai, parce que mon cerveau, il aime bien quand c'est bien rangé, bah, j'ai mis notre cher... j'ai mis des resters en premier. Et bah putain, je viens de préparer à l'instant, vraiment à l'instant, le 100%. Parce qu'il n'y a même pas trouvé platine. Hein. Il n'y a pas trouvé platine sur celui-là. On en a un sur Erika. Mais voilà, quoi, c'est vraiment du collectible. Il n'y a que ça. En même temps, il n'y a pas beaucoup grand chose de plus à faire. D'ailleurs, vous avez vu, j'ai préparé voilà, la vidéo photoshoot. Avec, alors bah, vous la verrez peut-être en entier à la fin du stream. Mais il y a un petit peu. Alors, il y a du Burley Manatsi, il y a du Nouveau Capsula. Il y a un clip de Sphere Game Legendary, il n'y a pas de Stretch Geons. Et puis voilà. Pas trop mal. Alors, je m'installe. Hop, bienvenue. Alors, en tout cas, alors ça va être un de ces 100% où ça va me péter les couilles ce putain de branchement de merde. Hop. Ou du coup, en fait, je vais devoir avoir un guide vidéo sous les yeux. Pour la simple et bonne raison que je vais vous montrer un peu le guide PSTHC, qui est un site que j'utilise très régulièrement pour tout ce qui est les 100%, ce genre de choses. Voilà, je l'utilise très très régulièrement. Alors ça, c'est ma chaîne au Crippler, rien à voir. Et voilà, en fait, ce qu'on doit faire. Enfin, non, c'est pas exactement ce qu'on doit faire. Je vais vous montrer. Voilà, tous les trophées du jeu. Donnelly, Jacobson, Esther, Paul, on les a. Stacker Aramin, on l'a. Rétuire. Ouais, tout ça, on a. Enfin, alors, ils disent que je l'ai parce que c'est sur mon autre compte. Là, on est sur le compte Let's Play. Donc, du coup, c'est honnête, donc se noyer une fois. Donc, ça, à la limite, j'ai pas besoin d'un guide. Hein. Pareil pour le dernier, c'est l'homme des rochers, marcher 5000 pas. J'en ai pas besoin non plus. C'est des trophées qui vont se faire naturellement lorsqu'on fera les collectibles. Sauf qu'en fait, on a 4 urnes à débloquer dans le jeu. Donc je pense qu'on va commencer directement à faire ces 3 trophées là. Et après on refera une première fois le jeu avec les voix, ici. Et on fera une deuxième fois le jeu avec les commentaires. Je pense qu'on va organiser le 100% comme ça. C'est comme ça que j'avais à peu près prévu. Et du coup, ouais, le problème c'est que moi j'aimerais bien... on va commencer par se faire chier à aller trouver un petit peu les urnes, même si je pense avoir regardé un petit peu la vidéo à côté, en faisant la sélection de chapitres. Mais voilà, vraiment, voilà, on va devoir bien se faire chier à ce niveau-là. Même si, comme j'ai dit, genre, ce trophée-là, on va le faire en premier, se noyer, on se fout dans la flotte et c'est bon. Ici, ça va se faire au fur et à mesure qu'on fait nos runs. Et après, je ferai des tours sur moi-même s'il faut. Hein. Vous connaissez la tactique. Et on fera celle-là aussi dans cette partie-là. Donc on est parti. Hein. Donc voilà. Donc on a voilà. Donc bien. Oh, mais oui, j'ai regardé Star Wars. Bah non. Ah si, j'ai regardé une vidéo YouTube tout à l'heure. Oui, parce que j'étais en train de rebosser un peu mon planning et c'est plus simple d'avoir YouTube sur ma Play. C'est vrai ça. Donc je vais échanger de place ça comme ça. Je vais maintenant couper le son également de Spotify. Nous allons jouer uniquement avec le son de la console, mesdames et messieurs. J'adore la musique de Derester, elle est très très bien. Derester épisode 2, 3 ans après, presque. C'est parti. Ouais, alors techniquement, on est sur l'épisode 2. En fait, je ne sais pas comment faire pour des resters, pour comment organiser le 100%. Est-ce qu'on se fait un gros stream aujourd'hui, on se fait tout, ou est-ce que on décide de jeu con PQ, hein. Ou alors est-ce qu'on décide de couper en deux les deux parties. Comme ça, je fais une partie avec les voix du narrateur, parce que c'est ce que j'ai prévu de faire. Et là, demain, admettons du coup, on se fait les voix des développeurs. Je ne sais pas. Alors, est-ce que j'ai un accès à... Oui. Non, je ne l'ai pas. Et bah du coup, mesdames et messieurs, nous devrons du coup nous taper. Bon, en soi, on va lier l'utile et l'agréable. On va d'abord faire, vu qu'on doit faire le jeu une première fois, autant faire directement avec les développeurs, hein. Le jeu est quand même assez... Je trouve vraiment le jeu assez bien, donc franchement... Allez, premier trophée. Ce sera mieux. Comme ça, voilà, vous voyez les trophées spawn à droite. Donc Seonade. Voilà, premier trophée, il est rapide à avoir. Au moins, on l'a tout de suite. Donc on est parti. Donc voilà, donc on était à côté du phare. Du coup, on est avec les voix des développeurs. Donc du coup, je vais juste me garder. Voilà. Donc au début du chapitre, dans la maison en face de votre point de départ. Donc c'est un walking simulator, hein, pour ceux qui n'ont pas vu le jeu de base, avec des magnifiques chiottes. Elles sont al dente, hein, vraiment. Un radiateur, ouais. Ça fait longtemps que j'ai pas fait le jeu. Et bah voilà, ces bulles là, ce sont simplement les bulles des développeurs qu'on devra essayer de rejoindre à chaque fois. Ah, il me faudrait les sous-titres. Pour moi, hein, déjà, mais également pour les personnes malentendantes. Il y a beaucoup de détails dans cet endroit.
Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that
alors ça se met pas, ça se mettra je pense au prochain. Alors
all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of
story j'ai rencontré après je pense.
Intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff. I kind of wanted to bring some of that
ah bah c'est ici.
So if you look around you, you see that there's a lot of...
J'écouterai, bah, celui-là je peux pas vraiment l'écouter. Est-ce que je peux écouter celui-là?
Hello everyone,
oui.
I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really, really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-platform release, and we wanted to add in this developer's commentary just to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the ideas behind it.
Ouais, il voulait faire une multiplateforme, c'était bien ça. Donc voilà, donc il voulait ajouter des commentaires de développeurs pour un peu donner des idées sur, enfin donner des informations sur comment ça s'est fait, tout simplement. Et je trouve ça grave intéressant. Il y a un autre jeu qui a également ça. C'est pas de Chinese Room, enfin je crois pas en tout cas. Il est là-bas. C'est Gone Home. Un peu dans le même style que des Resta. Et encore, parce que Gone Home ça se passe dans une maison et tu enquêtes. Il y a un côté un peu voyeur dans Gone Home que j'ai fait en let's play. N'hésitez pas à le voir sur ma chaîne YouTube. Chaîne YouTube Cypherhook évidemment. Je l'avais proposé en let's play. Il est pas long du tout. Il dure 2 heures max. Si vous voulez, à la fin de The Stream, je vous invite. Soit vous êtes sur Twitch et dans ce cas, je vous invite à attendre la fin du stream avant de partir sur YouTube. Par contre, si vous regardez la VOD, terminez la VOD, hein, ça fait plaisir. Regardez les autres aussi, hein, ça peut être sympa. Même le premier épisode de Dear Esther, hein, si vous voulez vous intéresser au jeu. Mais surtout, n'hésitez pas également à voir Gnome, qui était un jeu un peu dans le même style. Je peux vous raconter l'histoire. En gros, en 95, une fille rentre dans la maison familiale après avoir fait un tour d'Europe. Et en étant revenue, elle s'attend à ce que tout le monde la reçoive, sauf qu'en fait, à la maison, il n'y a personne. Et c'est totalement bizarre. Et donc, du coup, ce qu'elle fait, c'est qu'elle se balade dans toute sa maison afin d'essayer de trouver des indices sur qu'est-ce qui s'est passé, pourquoi ils ne sont plus là. Et c'est un jeu qui est très très beau. C'est un jeu qui est très très beau, même si, enfin, il soutient une cause. Je vais pas dire laquelle parce que c'est un peu spoilant sinon, mais c'est vraiment très très bien Gnome. Mais Derester est un peu dans le même style. Et pourquoi est-ce que dans le phare j'ai regardé comme un abruti en haut? Alors c'est pas dans cette maison-là. Il y a un élément que je trouve très stylé que j'ai découvert un an, non. Je l'ai découvert genre 2 ans après avoir fait le jeu. Je vais revenir. De toute façon, quand on va revenir, je pense qu'il y aura une autre maison un peu plus loin dans le jeu. J'irai regarder voir si c'est là. Mais je vous montrerai. Voilà. Allez, on est parti pour le deuxième. Je
So,
continue à avancer en même temps, vous en
you,
faites pas.
in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different.
Ah, c'est aléatoire. Oh.
This is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
Putain, je me dis que franchement, faire un jeu vidéo, le faire, c'est-à-dire vraiment dans le processus créatif, mais pas dans la prod, parce que j'ai clairement pas les compétences pour. Franchement, ce serait super intéressant. Oui. Bah oui. Comme tous les jours. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? C'est pas grave. Dis-moi.
C'est le nouveau shampoing,
D'accord.
parce qu'on n'a plus les produits supérieurs.
Mhm.
Donc ça, c'est le shampoing.
Ok.
Il y a le truc blanc et opaque.
Ouais.
C'est le gel douche.
Opaque
Et-
de douche, ouais.
Et l'autre opaque, mais un peu jaune,
Mhm.
c'est encore l'après-shampoing de la supérieure.
Ok, ça marche. Voilà. Vous avez pu avoir les informations pour mon shampoing, ça me fait plaisir. Ma maman. Oui, parce que quand je suis en vidéo, je mets en pause la vidéo, mais là, c'est pas trop possible. Du coup, j'ai pas suivi la fin. C'est pas très grave.
Part of the point about the whole game thing was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were. And I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can turn to. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it. And one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a completely different event happen or a completely different story happen. And it kind of feels very gamey in that way that actually one of the things I love about writing for games is that you hand over so much control to the player that it becomes their story, and that's really, really important rather than trying to force them. So using randomized blocks of voiceover in the game and
Ah, des blocs de voix aléatoires. Ok, je vois ce qu'il veut dire alors dans une expérience unique. C'est pas tant le cas que ça. Hein.
feeling every time you go through, and that's kind of interesting for me because I like the idea of going, well, not everyone has to have the same experience, and because it's interactive, you have the capacity to have very different experiences occupying the same space. So yeah, but balancing all that then becomes an absolute nightmare.
I think it's nice
Étonne.
because everybody gets a personal experience. Like I love reading the forums and seeing how people come and they sort of tell their story and what they interpreted of it, and then you see other people discussing what they thought of it. And to me, it's kind of nice because everybody takes something unique away from it.
C'est intéressant. Après, ils ont fait leur jeu, donc ils le connaissent mieux que moi, hein, j'imagine. Mais genre, c'est tellement minime qu'en vrai, déjà, c'est un truc un peu triste. J'ai vu que alors, tout à l'heure, là, c'est en installant le jeu, parfaitement au hasard, j'ai vu que j'avais un collègue que j'ai en ami sur la Play qui a joué au jeu. Il a joué. Je sais pas s'il l'a fini ou quoi que ce soit. On n'en a jamais parlé. Et je pense même que si on en parlait, je pense que le fait qu'il y ait une échographie sur une table d'une quelconque maison, je pense pas que ce soit quelque chose qu'il ait vu ou que j'ai vu, que quoi que ce soit. Et je trouve ça un peu dommage. Ouais, c'est peut-être un effort peut-être de perfectionnisme un petit peu trop, je dirais.
When I wrote the
Demandez alors.
music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely
Devant moi,
no
dans les-
budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in sound art, I wanted to use samples in a different way that wasn't just using it to sound like a violin. I wanted to time stretch and manipulate samples to make something different and strange and quite unique. But then when we got the Indie Fund money, I had the amazing opportunity to re-record the music with live players. And that was so exciting for me actually, because that's where it comes to life. And I thought long and hard about whether to write new music, going from the mod to the commercial version, but actually I decided that my initial and original emotional response to the game was probably going to be the strongest
Du coup, t'as pris
response
quelle
and
musique?
reaction that I had. So I just literally the music
J'ai précisé que j'ai composé pour les
samples, I
samples.
then wrote
J'ai
up
adapté pour les
for,
instruments.
live instruments. But what they bring to it is transformative actually. And I think the beach is a really good example of this, where you know you have these awful samples soaring away, and then you have the string quartet playing this very bleak, very sparse music, and they bring the presence of the island immediately to it, and it comes to life. And that's the exciting thing about it. It wasn't a huge budget, but just having that experience of working with the players was just magical.
Ok. Ah, ça se comprend, hein, si elle a pu travailler avec d'autres musiciens pour faire les musiques du jeu. Alors du coup, elle avait fait des samples. Et ces samples lui ont... Du coup, ce que je me suis dit, c'est ok, mais du coup, les samples, c'est ce qu'elle avait mis dans le mode. C'est posé la question, elle s'est dit, je dois réécrire des musiques ou utiliser les samples. Elle s'est dit, je vais utiliser les samples, mais je vais les réécrire pour en faire des musiques avec instruments. Si j'ai tout compris, c'est ça. Mais en vrai, c'est une bonne idée. On est vraiment sur le côté remake, hein.
Everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dreamlike, symbolic, poetic thing. And it always had frustrated me in games with game writing. This has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic language. It's very exposition-y.
Ah bah oui, hein, ça forcément.
And you'd have like art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe the character, tell the player what to do. And it just seemed like the most boring thing you could do with words in a game. And why couldn't a writer have the same artistic freedom as a visual artist or an audio designer or a musician in terms of being able to say...
Ouais, bon, après c'est compliqué, hein.
It's just about creating this kind of emotional tone, this emotional space. And it's really, I still love that about the game. It's one of the things I love so much about Nigel's voiceover is it has this really odd, disconnected,
C'est Nigel.
dreamlike quality
Okay.
to it.
Nigel.
You might finish the game and not actually understand anything that happened, but you're being carried along in the
On peut finir le jeu et n'avoir rien compris ce qui se passe. C'est exactement ce que j'ai fait la première fois.
I get into trouble saying things like this. The same design principle applies as this to Halo. It's 30 seconds of fun, or 30 seconds of depressing engagement, I guess, in our case. But it is about that loop of being in the moment in the game constantly, and that's actually the critical thing that matters.
En fait, le problème, c'est que le texte, il a un quart d'heure de retard sur la voix. Donc, en fait, la voix, je comprends ce qu'il dit. Et tout à l'heure, je me suis dit, oh, il est au début du texte, vas-y, je vais pas écouter ce qu'il raconte, je vais juste lire le texte, tu vois, je vais le lire. Au fur et à mesure, bah, je le lis en même temps et j'aurais fini avant lui. Et sauf que bah, là, finalement, il a eu de l'avance. Oh.
This symbol on the beach, which is
Oui, le nombre d'or, oui,
golden
il est là.
ratio,
C'est ça.
it's one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod. In the original mod, there was an awful lot of more kind of symbols and kind of a much more kind of mystical, sort of magical element to the island. There was a lot of very weird stuff in there. And a lot of them came out.
Oula, beaucoup de ces choses ont été retirées de la version commerciale parce qu'elles étaient un peu trop explicites. T'as mis une croix gammée dans ton jeu ou quoi?
there's still some stuff which you can only actually see or experience if you are not playing the game, if you're looking at it from editor. We had in the original mods things like trees planted to mirror the shape of the M5, or there's a whole bunch of things that are there to represent star clusters and all kinds of things like that. And we'll probably talk a bit more about kind of like hidden details and the secrets in the game as we go through. But that was really interesting for us in terms of the design of it, of going, you've got your kind of your conscious, explicit play experience, but games are always constantly manipulating your mood and your feelings and the decisions you're making. And so really trying to create a space that had all of these kind of subliminals in it was a really interesting thing that we wanted to do, both with the original, and then I think it got lifted up into a much more sophisticated version when we went to the commercial, because Rob was able to bring that sort of level of artistry to the visuals that really got that kind of sense of hidden meaning in there. And that was really important, given how kind of complex and symbol heavy and poetic the story is, where a lot of it doesn't actually make any sense, but it's about kind of leaving you with these, I guess, like the half-life of ideas and thoughts that you can't quite shake that stay with you. So we really were trying to get that blend of how music, story and visuals could all create that really sort of uncanny structure that you wouldn't necessarily be able to define properly, but you knew it kind of had a meaning.
Encore une fois, il a de l'avance sur le texte. Bon. Ouais, vraiment, c'est le jeu se veut poétique et ouais, ce qu'il dit rentre parfaitement dedans. C'est vraiment, ils ont fait quelque chose qui part totalement dans le thème et qui, surtout en fait, tu peux faire le jeu autant de fois que tu veux. Ouais, c'est ça. C'est vraiment, t'auras peut-être la même. Enfin, moi personnellement, c'est parce que j'ai fait le jeu 2-3 fois maintenant. J'ai prendre un screen ici. Il faudrait pas que j'ai le. J'aimerais avoir le nombre d'or, mais ouais, comme ça c'est bien. Je vais prendre un petit screen de la zone. Bah attends, c'est pas possible alors. Voilà. Du coup, ouais, on le voit. Ouais, c'est pas méga dérangeant ici. Ce sera mon screen pour la VOD. Ok. Bon, en vrai, c'est intéressant quand même ce qu'il raconte. J'en ai encore un tout le moins. Ouais, ici. Moi, franchement, le jeu, il est vraiment bien. C'est vraiment un jeu que je pourrais conseiller à quelqu'un qui connaît pas trop le jeu vidéo. Et ma copine, par contre, je pourrais, ma copine. Mais... Je sais pas.
So something I wanted to do as an artist was create some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island. There are some areas of the game where it's a little bit more quieter, there's no music or there's no voiceovers. So I kind of wanted to create a bit of an incentive for people to explore. And you'll find around the island that these kind of like random scattered items that are usually slightly out of place from the environment themselves, but in another aspect they actually bring a little bit of story to the island itself, usually to the island or to the actual protagonists or you know, the characters that surround it. So you'll find around the island these little props and stuff. Just keep your eye out for it if you're exploring.
Ouais, Rob, il a l'air un peu moins sûr de ce qu'il raconte quand même, malheureusement, mais il va être un petit peu plus hésitant. Fais demi-tour pour revenir monter l'escalier derrière la plage, la barque, la plage. Et du coup, juste avant la fin du chapitre, on traverse un champ de menhir pour l'urne. Ouais, je vais faire l'urne et oui, les asins de l'espace, évidemment, si vous avez reconnu. J'essaie de choper les urnes en même temps que je fais les commentaires. Comme ça, il manquera que les voix. Ça me paraît bien. Ah oui, on ne peut pas courir dans juste un walking simulator. Hein. C'est fait pour profiter des zones, prendre des petites photos. C'est vrai que le photoshoot de Esther va être un petit peu comme celui d'Edith Finch, pour ceux qui se rappellent. C'est-à-dire, il y a clairement moyen d'avoir plein de Il y a moyen d'avoir beaucoup de machins. Il y a clairement moyen de récupérer beaucoup de clips, tout simplement. Hein. Beaucoup de clips. Ici. Donc c'est celle-là.
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, where you had 3 options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship, we don't want to set it in Eastern Europe, so it's got to be on this kind of like this desolate landscape, and we want to limit the player, so an island seems like a natural choice. And it's really interesting how you start from that, and we had this big lump of clay on a table that we were carving out paths and things to annoying the cleaners and things like that. And Jess and I were talking, and Jess started making sort of snippets of music to kind of go in there. And then all of a sudden we just went, oh, that's the story.
C'est énervé les femmes de ménage.
We started, I think, from the place. And when we started looking at photographs of Bore, we started going and reading some of the history behind it. Suddenly that was it. And it just was really, really naturally became, this is the place. This is what happened here, this is how it feels, and then everything else kind of coalesced around that.
Yeah, I think as an artist it made my job a lot easier because those islands are so kind of like the environment is kind of hostile. You're out there in the Hebrides, you've got this kind of like inclement weather, you've got cold, rain, snow. It's a very kind of
Maintenant, ils ont une ligne d'avance.
It's also at the same time very beautiful, and it's this kind of like stark, bare landscape, but that has this beautiful surroundings.
C'est vrai que c'est beau. Hein.
In
On peut
terms
prendre des
of
petits
art,
screens
I
et
think
tout
it
comme
really
ça,
helped
regarde, comme ça. Hein.
me, to portray a lot of the themes in Dear Esther.
And there was a natural fit with the music as well. It suggested a musical style, which was really key, I think.
J'ai cru qu'elle a dit cake. Ok. Alors.
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music, and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther, but I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music. But that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote. And I think for me it's really interesting about how things that you've written earlier, years before, sometimes come in really, really useful and fit. So I always tell people and students not to despair if something doesn't get used or doesn't work at the time, because actually there'll come a place or in a time where you think, hang on a minute, I've got something that fits. So in terms of that memorable theme, the Remember theme gets used in multitude of different ways during the game. And one of the things it does is helps you to identify the kind of psychic place that you're in the game. So the theme is played in lots of different ways, and actually you'll notice that as you go through the game, it becomes more and more broken and more manipulated and broken down as the player goes through the journey and as you're psychologically struggling to get to the end point in the game. So music's really, really useful for highlighting
Jess, elle a du retard.
psychological mood. And we talk a lot about psychogeography, which always sounds a bit pretentious, but actually I think it's really important to what the three of us did in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, maybe you want to
sort
talk
of like
a bit
the
about
core
that.
kind of idea about psychogeography. If you're not in the place you're in, is not the place you're in, or you create the place you're in. It's not just as you're here and then the landscape's out there, but you don't navigate like a city by street signs and by those kind of formal things. You navigate it by the things which are significant to you in the way that you've lived in that space. And I think that was really kind of key to, I think it's really central to how the fusion of art and story and music come together in Dear Esther, because it's not a place where we're going, right, we have to lead the player up here because it's a natural formation, and then you would naturally have a piece of music here because you come around a corner. But the story, music and art all work around the idea of what's going on in the narrator's head at this point. How do we represent his emotional state relative to this landscape? And again, it's that idea of the game is, it's a dream of a place. It's like the idea of it being a fever dream or a coma dream, which obviously ties in a lot with the kind of story, and we'll come back to in a lot more detail when we get to the caves a bit later on.
Oui, il a 6 ans d'avance, quoi. Waouh. Oui, j'ai pas pu tout lire. C'est génial. Allez, on passe à la suite.
White Lines.
Il parle de ça là-bas.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Bora and the Hebrides. If their disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it because it feels really real because it references a real thing. And I don't know, there's something really special about that. But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to get these things in here.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in real life. But that's really cool.
Du coup, Rob, il parle, comprends pas.
My thing about the White Lines is that it was this completely surreal thing, but also it was kind of, it just added to the landscape. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that? And putting that into the game was kind of challenging because to me it just seemed like, oh, it's going to be really hard to pull off in a way that's kind of realistic. But then when you look at the kind of art style of the game, it's not really a realistic thing. Like everything is half imagined. So in that way it kind of really fit into the landscape, and it kind of creates this amazing sort of landmark that you see in the environment. And I just found it really interesting to hear about that.
I think it's one of those things where it's not a realistic place. And I mean, no game is a realistic place anyway, but one of those things where understanding that you're making something which isn't real and you have that kind of capacity to to explore it artistically. And we'll come back and talk about sort of like it not being realistic, I think, in a little while. But that's really, really important because then you can say it's about what these things kind of represent or how they make you feel as a player, not about going, is this accurate? And I get really inspired by sort of doing a lot of research into kind of history and things like that with all of our games. Because you can just find those things that just kind of like speak to you. But it's amazing you can find that in like an 18th century book and go, that really speaks to me now, that has meaning now, and that's fascinating, I think.
Alors, je vais regarder très rapidement. Alors, Chinese Room, je sais que j'ai refait un jeu qu'ils avaient fait, mais je crois qu'ils ont fait... Ouais, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Ils ont fait Amnesia aussi. Bon, d'accord. Ils ont fait Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, que j'avais bien aimé, que je vous ferai peut-être en let's play bientôt. Voilà, hein, sans transition. Allez, on continue.
Something that I wanted to bring through in the art of the game was the same kind of fidelity that you find in both Jessica's music and Dan's writing. In the same kind of way that you have all of these little details, these very close attentions to detail that kind of really bring richness to the story. And something that was missing in the original mod version was just this lack of a visual layer of story. And something that I did throughout the art of the game is to add in all these little details here and there, little bits of story, little links to certain things that you may or may not hear or see, just a layer of richness in the world and give you some kind of reward for exploring. So keep your eye out as you look around.
Évidemment, toujours être attentif au tout ce qui est les détails des environnements, tout ça. C'est comme ça, mine de rien, qu'on fait des 100%. Voilà, j'ai pas grand chose de plus à dire
There's
sur
a
ce qu'il vient de
scene
dire.
in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about cellador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where I think it's Chuck at that point, as the vocalist before Mike Patton, just says Dear Esther, and it really lodged with me because the sound Dear Esther just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it, and
Grosse anecdote
the
sur ça.
idea of it being this series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out of going, that's just a really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together, and to do it that way rather than writing a traditional plot as such. So yeah, Dear Esther, Faith No More and Doom, that's where it comes from.
C'est très intéressant, je trouve, en fait, la façon dont ils ont trouvé le nom de leur jeu. En fait, alors, ça lui est resté en tête parce que ça sonnait bien et que c'était. En fait, il y a des mots comme ça, des resters. Je sais qu'il y a. Je sais pas s'il y a des. Je connais pas exactement le mot, en fait. Enfin, les mots en tout cas. C'est des noms qui sonnent spécialement bien, mais entre eux. C'est des mots plutôt pas. J'ai mis des noms, mais c'est pas. C'est plus des mots qui sonnent spécialement bien. Ah, je trouve pas comme ça, mais c'est un nom. C'est un nom, c'est un nom particulier. C'est en gros des mots qui vont ensemble et qui en fait ont une profondeur artistique. Voilà. Et donc lui, des resters, ça lui a dit, putain, avec la tonalité, ça lui a fait à peu près la même chose. Voilà. J'avais un autre exemple aussi sur ça.
I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have played it or are talking about it is this idea of
Ah,
is
est-ce
the
que l'île est bien réelle? Ouf.
is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had? Does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the original mod, was can we put a story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you have will always have questions, and you'll never be able to fully trust what you think you understand about the game. So it's challenging, I think, for that result. It becomes quite a challenging kind of game story because of that, because you don't ever get that situation to go, I understand it now, I can walk away from this thing and it's all closed off and it's tidy. It was a very deliberate attempt to say, no matter where you think you are with this story, you're always questioning whether or not that's right.
C'est là où je trouve qu'il a un peu tort sur. Je dis pas qu'il a raté son coup, mais juste que des resters, à partir du moment où tu as une théorie et que c'est une théorie, la théorie actuelle, alors comme je vous avais dit, alors je crois que je l'avais dit à la fin du let's play, je me rappelle plus, mais en gros, pour expliquer rapidement, en fait, le narrateur est en réalité Paul. Ouais, en fait, c'est Paul, le mari d'Esther, et Esther Donnelly. Et en fait, il est en plein délire suite à la fameuse maladie. Enfin, il est en plein, en fait, il est en plein délire à cause de l'accident de sa femme sur l'autoroute, qu'on voit un peu plus tard dans le jeu. Et en fait, l'île, en fait, l'île, c'est tout simplement fait une représentation de son esprit. Donc avec les grottes, avec du coup également la métaphore de la naissance, etc. Enfin de la renaissance en tout cas. Donc en fait, on est tout simplement en plein deuil. On est en plein deuil du personnage là actuellement. Deuil de Esther et deuil également de lui-même, puisque à la fin du jeu, il se suicide. Voilà. C'est la théorie. Alors là, c'est un peu décousu, je peux comprendre, hein, parce que ça fait mine de rien 2 ans que j'ai pas rejoué au jeu. Mais voilà, on est sur ce qui est considéré comme étant la théorie la plus communément admise. Voilà, on va dire ça comme ça. Donc voilà, donc il restera juste un seul morceau pour ce chapitre-là.
With the audio and the music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic. I wanted to leave room for the player to think and to dream and to wonder and to put their own interpretation into what was happening. And I think the problem with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and there really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret. And that was one of my favourite things, that they placed themselves so directly into the game, and it's their experience. And I think that's actually the greatest success of the game on all points, from the story to Rob's art to the music, is we all left space for the player to dream.
Voilà, ouais, je suis plutôt d'accord, même si en soi c'est également une bonne excuse pour qu'il y ait un peu moins de moyens dans le jeu, hein. Parce que du coup t'as pas besoin de mettre beaucoup de musique.
So there's a lot of places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just, some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. So it's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting, where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff, that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
Tac, du coup on a fait, voilà, on a fait les 15 premiers morceaux de commentaires, j'espère que ça vous plaît. Il y a juste la première rune que je ne trouve pas. Alors où est-ce qu'elle est? Elle est là-haut. En fait elle est là. Donc autrement dit, elle est vraiment introuvable comme ça, quoi. Genre faut vraiment la chercher, quoi, pour la trouver. Bah, elle est pas là. Bah non. Après, si je voyais ce que je devais chercher... Ah non, c'est vraiment une urne... Ah bah elle est là. Voilà, première urne. Voilà, fin du chapitre 1. Chapitre 2, c'est avant la fin du chapitre. Après avoir passé la maison abandonnée sur la falaise. Garde en tête, maison abandonnée, falaise. Et nous on continue par là. Pam, 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 pam. J'espère en tout cas que ça vous plaît. On est déjà 48 minutes de stream. Je crois que malheureusement, il va falloir une deuxième partie du 100%. Ça me dérange pas. Ça me dérange pas. Je compte faire à peu près 2 heures sur le jeu. Donc je pense que ouais. On va... On verra. Je table à peu près sur 2 heures de stream. À peu près. Parce que je trouve que j'ai pas vraiment envie de faire 3 heures sur un petit jeu comme ça. Ce serait un peu bourrin. Ce serait bourrin. Alors. Donc on continue. Hein.
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself. So one of the things that I did with the music was to write the island as if she or he were a character in its own right. And that's really important, I think, that you're going through this space and actually it's completely devoid of people, but the music in a way populates the island, and that the voice of the island speaks to you through the music.
Which is
Ceci est ce qu'il dit quand même.
That's really come on in terms of later games we've done, that sowed the seeds for the way in which we approach music in Rapture, where it was very specifically the voice of characters. A Machine for Pigs as well, where the music was about being Lily's voice in the game, Lily's representation in the game. So it's interesting how, looking back on Esther, a lot of those kind of ideas were tried out here that then came on to take other forms in stuff we've done since. All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things. And it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary, and it's really interesting, and it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you knew what you were doing. For me, it was very interesting that you could play some of the best moments of Doom are the bits where nothing's happening and you're just doing it, or System Shock, or those games that I absolutely love. Those quiet moments were the really powerful ones. But Esther is definitely slower than a lot of games, and I think that's actually why it's lasted. I think if we did have moments where we went, should it be faster, should we put a sprint button in, but I'm so pleased that we kind of held our nerve and went, no, just as like in real life, I don't run everywhere because that would be weird. It's okay to have a game where you don't run everywhere, and actually it is a bit weird to run everywhere, but if you're going to do that, then you've got to support it in other ways, and I think the music was a really powerful way of supporting that change of pace.
What's really funny for me though, Dan, is that shamefully I'd never played a game before I worked on Dear Esther, so I didn't realise that all games weren't like this, which is now looking back really naive. But I didn't realise that games didn't have, always have, this slow pace, and I thought there were lots of meditative.
Ah, j'ai jamais joué à un jeu avant de travailler sur des Esther.
Actually wasn't really the case at the time, and that's exploded since. But in terms of the music, supporting that pace that you'd set emotionally felt really important. So if you listen to the music, actually the BPM is a very slow walking speed, and it just almost, there's a lot of things now that say it's called entrainment, that it slows your heartbeat, or it can speed up your heartbeat when you listen to music. And actually I think what the Esther music does really successfully is it makes you almost accept, and more than accept, that speed. You actually start to feel that's the pace of your journey, and that I really like that about the music actually.
It makes you just comfortable with that pace too. I think it just eases you into it. You feel relaxed.
C'est toujours le souci, hein. Maintenant ils discutent, mais en fait, nous on peut pas lire. Donc voilà, mais en vrai c'est très intéressant quand même cette façon de voir le Walking Simulator. Et aussi leur vision un peu avec la chose, genre pour Dan c'était évident que ce soit comme ça, pour Jess elle connaissait pas, donc en soi ça lui paraissait même bizarre que les autres jeux soient pas comme ça. Je trouve ça intéressant. Donc on est sur celui-là.
The radio
Rien
mast
là-bas.
in Dear Esther was obviously there is a really important kind of design feature as well as its place within the story, and that I think came from, it's really interesting being a Half-Life mod to begin with, and the Citadel in Half-Life 2, that it tells you how far you are through the game. You're always looking up to the skyline, am I closer to the Citadel, can I see it, and it lets you know how near you are to the end of the game. And it was really important because Esther's so open in a way, and because there isn't this, you're not using kind of shootouts or kind of gating it with combat encounters to kind of constantly keep you moving, that it was really, really important that you always had that focal point of going, I know exactly from the beginning of the game, virtually right from the start, you know where you're going, you know where the game's going to end up, and you know that sooner or later you're going to be either at the base of that thing or climbing that thing, and it's always there, that red light. And I think particularly with the colour palette of the game, the fact that you've got this very, very, very clear red light that's unlike any of the other colours in the game immediately tells you as a player, this is what the shape of this thing is going to be. This is where I'm going. This gives me a purpose, even if the sort of moment by moment is a bit more abstract.
Yeah, and navigationally as well, it helps you. It draws you in the right direction as you play the game. You can never get lost if you just follow that one landmark.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place of where that sort of traditional game design is still, there's loads of it in Esther, it's just not necessarily done in quite the same way.
Ok, bon, c'est un peu intéressant quand même. C'est vrai que mine de rien, l'antenne, tu la vois quasiment tout le temps. Et à chaque fois que tu la suis, ouais, effectivement, tu peux pas te perdre. Je trouve ça intéressant, en vrai. Ils ont pensé à ce point. Alors du coup, là, on doit remonter un peu sur la plage derrière un conteneur. Et sur le sentier au bout du gouffre. Est-ce que ce serait du coup celui que je vois? Non, c'est celui-là, hein. Ouais, un conteneur détruit. Pour moi, c'est celui-là.
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, you know, from a distance you see the landscape. It's kind of a beautiful place in some ways, but something I wanted to bring to the game was that there's this second layer beneath the surface. Whereas if you look at things closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of very rotten. You know, everywhere you look, every rock, every grass surface, it has this layer of filth on it, and it's kind of been put in there just to kind of emphasize further that this island is a really unpleasant place to live. It's like if you scratch the surface, you see like just how corrupt this island is.
Hmm. Oh, c'est un peu du détail, mais après, c'est quand même sympa qu'ils le disent en soi. Pas grand chose à dire.
And it was basically Jess and I on a casting website, just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. And there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time round. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors. And we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in, we had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character in the game was so strong that he just, without virtually any direction, just came in and just got it. And one of the hardest things with the voiceover that we did was when we went from the mod, which had 3 potential narrative units per queue, to 4 potential narrative units per queue, was not only finding new bits of writing that kind of complemented and played off what was there in the original mod, but for Nigel to come back in, nearly 5 years later, and to just re-find that voice in exactly the same way and deliver it in a way that fitted in and complemented it was a real testament to his ability as an actor, I think. That apart from we had spent quite a lot of time trying to make the sound actually sound the same in terms of mic placement and things like that, but in terms of the actual delivery of those new monologues, you wouldn't know that was both written and acted sort of 4.5 years after the original.
C'est ça qui est fort. Franchement, le doublage, c'est fou.
The one person who's not in the room.
Ce qu'il raconte, franchement, je suis très impressionné.
Game kind of eventually was delivered, but also I think in terms of how the game has lasted, a huge amount of respect needs to go to Nigel Carrington for his work on it.
Voilà, j'ai rien à dire. Franchement, très bien joué. Donc, du coup, on a également celui-là avec le gouffre. Il y a un trophée si tu veux tomber dedans. Vraie anecdote.
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like we have no real death in the game, and from a design point of view, Dan, I mean, I don't know what you
it was really hard because you know, it was a game where we couldn't let the player die. We didn't want to have respawns, but we had to handle the fact that there would be both accidents where the player would fall off a cliff or something, but also the deliberate urges as a player.
Yeah.
You know, the first thing you're going to do is go, great, there's an ocean, how far out can I go? Or
Yeah.
there's a cliff that's really high, can I jump off it? And how do you have death in a game where you can't have the player die? Because if the player starts breaking up the experience by dying and reloading, then you're in a really, you start breaking the experience a lot. So
Yeah, I mean, we didn't want to also have like artificial boundaries, you know, where it's like an invisible wall. Like if you take a look through the game, you'll never see a place where you think you can get to, but you can't. There's always some kind of actual natural boundary or man-made boundary. So yeah, that was the other thing. We didn't really want to create this invisible wall around this thing. So
it kind of, the whole drove the way in which that sort of the very weird audio visual, probably one of the most dreamlike bits in the game, where if you do die and you get the kind of the heartbeat and the strange flashes of visuals. And I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the hole there and we hadn't had a place where we go, right, players will jump in this hole, we have to start from that basis, they will throw themselves down this hole, it kind of gave us the impetus to really, really focus on it. And I think the stuff like the drowning deaths and the cliff deaths are strong because the hole was there, and I'm not sure if the hole hadn't been there.
Parce que le trou est là, on a géré la mort, et ça c'est cool.
Which I'm really proud of. I think it's a really incredibly creative,
Ça fait déjà 1 heure.
interesting way of handling a player going out of bounds and of actually being able to reset the game when the player's basically done something you ideally wouldn't want them to do.
yeah, I kind of think it fits well with the theme of the game as well, because you don't really know what's just happened.
Yeah,
it's not
absolutely.
like it's not like you hear a death sound and then you kind of respawn. It's this kind of like very soft, very ambiguous change. You know?
There was a point in the original mod where if you died, it would do the whole Half-Life major fracture detected.
Yeah.
It's always brought a really good tone to the game.
Yeah, yeah.
Je trouve que c'est bien comme ils ont fait. On l'a pu voir tout à l'heure avec la noyade. Hop.
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But it's also a beautiful and magnificent place. And what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point they've played in a very sort of Scottish style actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write actually, because that has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big, and you know, you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts so the player can actually just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Yeah, I think that's it. Can I come in? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which is just epic,
pas dans cette
as
maison.
I said. You've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement. There's leaves blowing around, there's the clouds in the sky, there's the mist rising off of the grass. And
Mon Dieu.
then you've got voiceover
C'est calme.
coming in there. And I think it's just like
C'est ça que j'aime dans le jeu. C'est quand même très reposant.
together and just in perfect
C'est des
sync.
paysans.
Just kind of, it really brings you know, chills up your spine.
La voix off de Dan.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an
On peut
answer
trouver une échographe.
on
Ah bah
the
tiens,
table.
elle est là.
I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally.
voyez là?
How you understand the story. And not to say that you don't care as much if you don't.
Il y a une
find it,
petite ligne noire
but it
avec
just
une
adds
petite...
this feeling of just the ground falls away from it the first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash and Esther's death just means so
Ouais, là,
much
on
more.
la
When you go,
voit.
it's not just about her. There was an unborn child here.
Parce
And
que,
I think
alors,
that's where
je suis
the
désolé, alors là, c'est les
randomisation
personnes qui sont
is its
regarder
absolute peak,
le-
because it's
la
one
vidéo, elle
tiny
est...
detail that may or may not be there. But
Et
if
là,
it's
vous
there,
la voyez un tout
fundamentally
petit
changes the way
peu.
you feel about the entire thing. And that's the strength that the randomization elements in Esther kind of provide, that you go,
Alors,
you're likely kind of feeling about the story and your understanding about the
il,
story
ouais, il continue ce qu'il disait déjà tout à l'heure, oui, effectivement.
by the occurrence or not of one tiny little prop detail. And that's something which, those moments, I think, are what make it really, really special. So it's for me.
Ouais, à cause
it's
d'une réaction
almost
profonde,
like
bah ouais,
a
parce qu'on se dit,
walk
putain, elle est
on
morte
the
alors qu'elle
game,
était enceinte.
because when it happens, it's so profound.
Yeah, and it's again, it's just something that makes each playthrough more personal. I think, and this is what I love reading about.
On la voit bien.
You know, people finding these things and going, "Holy shit, I've just found this one thing that's going to change it. That's changed my interpretation."
Ça va pas
completely."
changer toute mon
Yeah,
interprétation.
absolutely.
Alors. En fait, il faudrait que j'essaye de retrouver l'image de l'endroit. Je trouverai pas. Mais en fait, il y a des fantômes dans le jeu. Est-ce que je peux... Ah, c'est possible que sur le stream on l'ait vu, mais alors très très rapidement. Ouais. Effectivement, c'est bien confirmé parce que je vois en fait ce que vous voyez là-bas, c'est un des fantômes de Esther. En fait, dans le jeu, il y a des fantômes qui sont cachés un peu comme des Easter eggs. Et en fait, les fantômes. Tac, du coup, je vais mettre l'autre écran. Voilà. En fait, les fantômes ressemblent à ça. Et celui qu'on voit ici, je crois qu'il a une lanterne. C'est pour ça qu'on voit. Et en fait, on en a loupé un. Bah, juste ici, en fait. C'était lorsqu'on était en bas, là-bas. Lorsqu'on était là-bas, en fait, on a levé la tête et on l'a pas vu parce qu'il est noir sur noir. Hein. Mais en fait, il était comme ça. Après, il s'est tourné. Il est parti dans la maison. Voilà. Ouais, vous pouvez regarder un petit peu sur YouTube, je vous invite. Moi, je trouve ça très cool. Voilà, je suis content. Donc, juste derrière la maison, il y en a encore une. Ah oui, ici.
So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting because when we made it, we kind of had to, you know, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type of thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game is absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2 because for what feels like hours, but it's probably only about 15 minutes, nothing happens and no necromorph comes at you, and it's absolutely terrifying because it's just this space and you're just left in it. So I think the kind of the bird here is really interesting because it can actually really, really make you jump. But I don't know if that was part of why people were saying that the game was really scary, but it was a real surprise when people started coming back and saying, this is a frightening game. And I don't know how much of that is to do with the ideas in the game are frightening when you think about them, and how much of it is to do with just the emptiness and the lack of kind of things in the game make it a really quite stressful or quite frightening place. But it was a real surprise, I think, that sort of reaction from a lot of players when we shipped it.
C'est très intéressant. Ouais, c'est intéressant qu'ils mettent le point dessus. C'est pas aussi arrivé, oui, que selon la façon dont les gens voient les jeux, enfin le consomment, leurs habitudes, etc. Et en fait, il suffit juste, ouais, c'est ça, d'une vision artistique un petit peu différente. Et du coup, bah, les gens, ils peuvent se marrer pendant un film d'horreur et avoir très peur pendant un film, on n'est pas dans le thriller.
So one of the things that
Je vais pas vite
influenced
crever,
the
moi.
visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively. I did a few tests at the beginning, and when I realized this wasn't possible, I kind of went back and I kind of did some research on different styles, and one of the ones that really struck me was this kind of impressionistic painterly style, where it's kind of like there's just enough shape and color there for you to form an image, but a lot of it is just your imagination. It's kind of like the believability of the environment is in your mind. So this is something that I really wanted to bring over into the game, and you'll see a lot of landscapes that kind of look very surreal, very kind of unreal, and that's mainly due to this impressionistic style.
C'est vrai que c'est assez fou quand même ce qu'ils ont réussi à faire. Hein. Juste cette vue-là. Je vais mettre ça en screen. Je m'excuserai, hein, je fais mes petits screens. J'ai limite envie de me faire un... En fait, on pourrait rester comme ça, on va pas avoir tout fait pendant un moment. J'ai limite envie, ouais, de couper en deux. Comme ça, je peux mettre plusieurs screens du jeu en miniature. Ce sera un peu abusé.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space that is about feeling, not thinking.
Yeah, I think the movies in particular, I think I hadn't watched the movies. I'd read the book and I played the game, but when I watched the movie, it kind of all made sense to me, like why I like the game so much and why I like the story. It's just like every shot is like a painting. It's like every shot has its story to tell. There's very little dialogue in the actual movie itself. There's just these long lingering shots, and each shot is amazingly beautiful and in its kind of desolation. And for me, that was like a huge influence, you know, like trying to bring some of that through into the environments. So that is definitely something I'm going to struggle not to talk about. But the game as well. I'd say the actual Stalker game has a big place in my heart. Like gaming-wise, it's one of the reasons I got into game art in the first place.
Yeah.
So that to me is a big part of it too.
Bon, je trouve ça intéressant quand même les inspirations de jeux, etc. Je profite juste parce que ici, on a un côté un petit peu caché, une petite plage. Je passais devant, non. En fait, on va avoir notre deuxième urne. Elle est là. On n'aura pas cherché longtemps. Voilà, on peut retourner du côté de... C'est une carcasse de navire en bois. Voilà, j'attendais qu'ils aient terminé parce que sinon je disais au milieu de leur truc, alors on va chercher l'urne. Vous allez peut-être me dire d'aller me faire enculer. Vous auriez plutôt raison. Ah, je commence à pas avoir la barbe qui pousse. Parce que je suis en vacances, du coup, au moment où cette vidéo sort, on est le 3 janvier. J'ai la barbe qui pousse, ça me gratte. Mon Dieu. Allez, donc sur la plage, on les restes d'un navire en bois. Il était un petit bateau.
One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of, like, if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of it's not obvious. It's not in your face. It's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know, and so like there's a lot of deliberate attempts in the game to recreate that feeling, and it's kind of hard to point out in many other places, but it's done in a way where every single rock, every single plant, every single cliff face has been deliberately placed and designed in a way to try and make you feel something in the game.
Cool.
This is
Ouais,
one
c'est
of
beaucoup
my
du ressenti.
favourite
Hein.
bits in the game where you come along the edge of the sort of gully.
J'écoute un petit peu à moitié maintenant.
It's one of the
J'avoue
first times
que
where most explicitly
au bout du 30e, bon,
suggesting that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment. But it works, I think, for me, because you just go, I don't understand it, but it's lodged somewhere in my head, and I can't get rid of it, and I can't unsee this. And I think for me, like in terms of my influences from books, I mean, there's the obvious sort of stuff like with Burroughs, Cut Up, and things like that going on. But it comes to the kind of books that I really love, that like Roadside Picnic, or the other one by the Strugatskys as well, I absolutely love, is The Ugly Swans. That's just full of these images that you go, I don't understand, I literally have no idea what's going on here, but I can't shake it, it's just got its hooks in me. And I think more recently you've got books like Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation does this so well, where nothing is understandable, but you feel the logic, but you can't understand the logic, but you feel like the logic's there. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing that games are so good at doing, of creating these things. And I think where a lot of game writing for me becomes kind of the wheels fall off it, is that they have these amazing ideas, and then suddenly there's this huge rush of going, right, we've developed this mythos and we've shown you all the tips of the iceberg, which are really interesting, but now we're just going to show you the whole iceberg. And actually that's never that satisfactory as a player, because it robs the mystery. And I think the best game writing is those kind of moments where you go, I feel like there's something just outside the edge of my vision, or just on the edge of my hearing, but it's the confidence to go, that's it, that's all you get, and the rest of it is up to your imagination. And I think it does loop back to games like Stalker. I think Skyrim at its best does it so well, where you just have these moments where you think, I want to know, but it's going to be down to my imagination to draw those things. And the player's imagination is the most powerful thing you've got in your design kit. There is nothing.
Ouais, Stalker, c'est un jeu de
on
shoot,
screen,
j'aime bien
there's
ça.
nothing you can do with audio, there's nothing you can do with dialogue that will ever be as powerful as the player's own imagination. So if you oversell the idea and oversell the image, what you're actually doing is you're kind of not only robbing the player of the opportunity to invest in the game, but you're also fundamentally opting for a weaker tool than what the player can bring to the experience themselves.
C'est vrai que je connais également un autre spawn pour des fantômes. Ouais, je suis désolé, rien à voir. Hein.
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast.
Tac, on passe au
And the
chapitre 3 après.
soundscapes
Hein.
I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that are, they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, And it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually. That the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.
Avec un bouton courir, ça pourrait être sympa. Mis à part ça. On est parti du coup pour le chapitre 3, les grottes. Qu'est-ce que c'est stylé, bordel. Oh là 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 là. Oh, moi je kiffe. Hein. Moi je kiffe ce genre d'imagerie, moi. Salut, je me suis défoncé la gueule. Bon, en même temps, t'as été con, hein. Voilà de méchant. T'as été con. Et c'est là, si vous reconnaissez, où j'ai pris mon premier screen de Esther.
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's you know, we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
Ouais, donc vraiment beaucoup plus spirituel. D'ailleurs, c'est ici, on remonte par là.
This, for me, is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing, it has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me. That you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song. And with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly into one. I mean, on a personal level, I've played the game hundreds of times now, and I still enter the caves and I look at Rob's work and I'm just absolutely overawed, just gobsmacked by its beauty. And I just think it's a really magical moment in gaming for me, actually. I know that probably sounds really dramatic, but I just think it absolutely hits something where everything just works together. And the music is so dreamlike. You know, Rob has talked about the journey through the body, and I think that's absolutely, for me, the music becomes so organic and fluid and actually very feminine and female at that point. You're hearing the voice of his love.
Ah, c'est très personnel, c'est compliqué de faire du commentaire de commentaire, alors du commentaire sur du personnel, là, comme ça.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself, but I think it is, I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just, it's a real high watermark. I kind of, it's one of the areas in all of the games we've made that I'm most proud of.
I think as well, you think you know what you're getting with Dear
Yes.
Esther for the first 45 minutes of the game, wherever we are at this point, and then you step into something completely unexpected and completely new, and I think it just throws the player such a curveball in such a wonderful way.
Franchement, c'est quand même ouf quand même que le mec il dise ah mais il y a un prêt et un poste d'Esther, tu vois. Moi je trouve ça quand même impressionnant quand même de se le dire. Et il a le droit de le penser, hein. C'est peut-être vrai. Comme je dis, hein, il a le droit de le penser. Mais c'est quand même fort quand même, hein, parce que Dan depuis tout à l'heure t'as l'impression que c'est le mec qui gère vraiment le projet, quoi. Tu vois, c'est vraiment le boss. Donc si c'est lui qui dit ça, tu te dis ah oui quand même, tu vois. C'est vraiment il en est fier.
I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things that if a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer, as a creative, is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, sort of, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over the last few years, and like Journey was a really, really good example of that game company really focusing on what's the emotional experience of playing this game. But I think, again, it's probably one of the reasons why Esther has lasted as long as it has done, because it's not a mechanical exercise, it's an exercise in trying to...
Si Esther est aujourd'hui considéré culte, ouais, c'est parce que au final le jeu a été un peu visionnaire. Il est devenu les walking simulator narratifs comme ça. En 2012, c'était pas du tout le genre de jeu qui était très populaire. Et puis au final, au fil et à mesure des années, on a eu d'autres jeux qui se sont mis un petit peu après, hein, Finished One et Did Finch pour... En fait, les jeux Annapurna, en fait. Même avec d'autres jeux comme Journey, comme Abzu, il y en a d'autres encore, hein. Il y a plein de jeux dans ce style-là et ça a bien fonctionné. Et Esther c'était un précurseur, en fait. Un petit peu comme les Indestructibles étaient pour les films de super-héros. C'était un des premiers. Et donc au final, voilà, quand tu ouvres ton livre d'histoire à la page Walking Simulator, et bah t'entends parler d'Edith Finch, de Finch, tout ça. Quand tu ouvres ton bouquin sur les films de super-héros, bah t'entends parler des Indestructibles. Même si ça n'a pas forcément... ils sont pas forcément inspirés, c'est quand même un des premiers, quoi.
And celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life 2 modders and they made it what it is. And so if you've made something that the real kind of hardcore of the hardcore in terms of these are first-person shooter modders have gone, this is really good and really special and we're behind this, then you've already got the support of a really amazing gaming community, and the fact that they championed it, we owe them a huge amount in terms of where we are. And I'm really proud to come out of that scene. I'm really proud to be a company and to be sitting here talking about a game that started life as a mod.
I think they're the ones that have really kind of like pushed us forward and given us the passion to be able to take it to a commercial level and give us the confidence to make us believe that there's an audience for this kind of thing.
C'est génial. Parce qu'en soi, ouais, la communauté de jeux vidéo comme ça, par rapport au mode, tout ça, c'était peut-être au début de Steam. Bah oui, Half-Life, c'est Valve, donc il y a des très bonnes chances que ce soit au tout début de Steam. C'est génial. 2012, oui, totalement Steam.
And I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first journey into thinking about how you write music for games rather than films. So I had this song that was a certain length, and Dan said, well, we don't know how long the player is going to take to traverse through that space. And I thought, oh no, he's right, and slightly panicked. So this was a very simple solution where the song was split in half, and then I wrote some drone music that could just play for as long as was needed as the player walks through the space, and then the second half of the song would seamlessly play. And it's very, very simple, but it's quite emblematic for me in terms of my career, because it was the first time that I had to think about the player. Because with film music, it's so simple. You know exactly what's going to happen when. But this concept of interactivity was so new for me. So I kind of looked back at it fondly because it's quite a basic approach to, compared to something like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, where that was an open world adventure where I had to really think about the player and their movement through the space. So I kind of look on this very fondly, this moment in the game.
Et parle d'Everybody Gone to the Rapture. Je vous en avais parlé tout à l'heure, et oui, c'est eux qui l'ont fait. En fait, je dois aller là-bas. Tac. Donc la suite va par là, mais nous on va aller à droite.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island.
La troisième urne du jeu.
You know, at this point in the game, is kind of the realization is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island, and the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the coma, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution, and there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something, it's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, yeah, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games.
C'est vrai qu'il y a eu une petite pause au moment. J'ai vu le bateau en papier passer. Vraiment, vous avez vu, hein, je me suis arrêté, je l'ai regardé passer. C'est totalement ça.
In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant it really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then it was, you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really, really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets, and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely. And rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, it was able to, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge, because suddenly I was having to write like a poet, of going, every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound has to be absolutely perfect, or it'll just feel like the narrator's voice is intruding on the rest of the experience. So it was, yeah, I think definitely the most challenging area of the game as a writer.
Bah, c'est quand même fort ce qu'il a fait. Hein. On soit sincère. Hein. Il faut y arriver.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves, you hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult. And yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we have this long corridor that's full of these kind of it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. And it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols
Dans
are a
l'eau.
lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of just, it's just total madness, you know. Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and confused, and you know, I think it really helps to bring the tension up at this point in the level as well. So you're kind of coming out of this dreamlike state a little bit.
Yeah, you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of the serenity into something that's a bit more disturbed than that.
J'adore les commentaires. Après, là, vous voyez que j'écoute quand même un petit peu. Je suis le lien surtout. Mais putain, on en a écouté 40, je vous le dis. Bon. Voilà.
We disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound. And I don't think there's any other way around that. Moments when you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me, because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's it's the one edge within it, and it breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely
Bon, ça continue.
hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air, and I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, this is all, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realization for me, but then you're having to go back under again, and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious, and that struggle. Booyah!
There's actually a really interesting thing about that underwater section there, though, is that, I don't know if you remember, but you had a certain piece of music that plays when you're underwater, and it's, to me, I really like that. It's kind of like, because at this point it's kind of like a very calm, relaxed type of a journey, and you go on the water and it starts to break apart a little bit, and it's almost like, you know, that kind of psychosis is still there. It's not complete bliss at this point, and and it helps to build the atmosphere up to this final jump.
So we're both saying that Dan's wrong?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good. That's the way it should be.
Hop. Je me rassois, hein, permettez.
The motorway scene, the biggest,
Well.
the biggest new addition to between the mod
Yeah.
and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Yeah, it's well, I wasn't sure where the idea spawned from to have this scene, whether I just sort of went off or we discussed it, or I can't remember, you know.
I can't remember. Can you remember? It just kind of appeared, didn't it? And then
Yeah, it was just this kind of, I think for me actually, I remember being some technical difficulty between the drop and then coming out at the end part, but it was like, it was the same thing that we dealt with in the past.
Résumé.
Like, how do we...
Ah, l'autoroute que... Ah, je me rappelle qu'il y avait un souci. Ah ouais, tu t'en rappelles? Non.
So from a technical standpoint, I think it might have been something to do that, but it was also, you know, just...
Ah oui, d'accord. Ah, il est cool le making of. Hein.
thing came from.
I think it's my favourite point in the whole game.
Ah, c'est pas ton moment les grottes, c'est pas ton moment préféré, super.
Absolutely, it's quite shocking, and it's so surreal, and it's so beautiful.
Est-ce que Esther est
And from an
enceinte?
audio
Ah,
that baby's
c'est vrai
heartbeat
que...
bringing us back to the idea of the ultrasound. Was Esther pregnant? And again, it's one of those moments that I think everything just kind of collates together, and it's so unexpected.
Yeah, for me it's like a moment of realization.
Yes.
It's like, it's, you know, it's coming to terms with something almost, you know.
whether or not what actually is going on at the moment is real, this did happen. There's kind of an absolute. I remember playtesting it, and I didn't know that the car can get switched out with a hospital gurney, and I must have played it. I was like 3 or 4 times into playtesting it, and the first time it switched out and it was a gurney instead of a room.
Ah, de base, ça devait une voiture.
Sitting there and going, oh god, that's just, and really being just stopped in my tracks by it. And it's one of those weird things you get when you're making a game, that you know you'll never have those moments that a player does, where you know it all so well. It's really, really rare to be in a situation where you actually get a genuine, fresh player's eye view on what you're making.
Yeah, I was always a bit worried that it was maybe a bit too literal. Like we'd gone a bit too literal with that. But I think looking back at it now, there's still a lot of strangeness going on there.
Ah bah ça c'est sûr, ouais. Il y avait une autoroute, t'as une civière.
Like very subtle details that are there that kind of still making you think, what does that mean? Like I think if you look closely, there's like coins scattered around and things like that. It's
And for me, it's, again, sorry to keep going on about it, but it's about layers of subconscious for me. That you start overground, you go into the caves, you go deeper, you're falling down, it's going down the rabbit hole effectively, and then you go to the deepest level, and that's actually the truth, that's the reality, that's what happened.
Voilà. Non mais c'est bien.
So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But
As
we
has
also
been
know
pointed out to you.
players. I mean, what a thing is if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love about, what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again, it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, you know, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. It gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike. But actually, I'm talking about, you know,
Pom 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 pom
It's like
pom.
making the ordinary
Bum.
extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Ah, d'accord, il attendait la fin du commentaire. Parce que je disais le jeu. Donc face à vous en sortant de l'eau. Where is... Non, c'est bon. C'est là. C'est vraiment la sensation de noyade, quoi. On est resté 1000 ans dans l'eau.
This scene for me is like really, really
Oh
iconic. Brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey, the body together. It's really kind of like a sort of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the
Je vais
visual.
regarder rapidement sous la dernière rune pour le trophée. Je suis désolé, hein, mais...
With a lot of the symbolism in the game.
Ok.
Like,
Je vois parfaitement, ouais. Le pire, c'est que je me rappelle très bien du jeu, je vois exactement,
how,
ouais.
the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this, and the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah,
Because we've gone, she sings always, always throughout, you know, we've got always, always, and then she sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way. And
it's rebirth, isn't it?
Yeah.
For me, it's his moment of clarity
Yeah.
and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
You're actually doing that as you go through.
But I the music especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like that kind of just totally made it.
Je n'ai rien écouté, je suis désolé. Mais là, mon cerveau n'a pas voulu. J'étais en train de lire la suite. Et écoutez, on va débloquer 2 trophées, j'imagine 3 peut-être. Peut-être qu'on débloquera également le trophée des 5000 pas, je pense. Je peux jouer. Oh, je marche aussi lentement. Allez. Chapitre 4, l'antenne. Au moins, ça permet de me refaire des Esther plutôt simplement. Allez, c'est parti.
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther. And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is that idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here has Morse code, and the Morse code is spelling out the word Esther. And I really, really liked this concept of that some people would understand that it was Morse code and try and figure out what it was saying. It also provided a really interesting rhythmical dynamic. And yeah, it's just about these ideas of hidden stories and layers, but it also starts to emphasise the obsessional nature, I think, of the story in Dear Esther, and his agitation and actually slight panic. So you're getting this rhythm that just repeats and repeats and repeats obsessively. So I think even if you don't understand that it's saying Esther, and even if you don't understand that it's Morse code, you're still getting this feeling of this obsessional repetition and slight panic that he has. And again, it's kind of it's the new chapter, and it's spelling out that something has changed at this point.
Effectivement.
It's probably the level which has
Sur le
changed most
côté.
from the original mod. I think it's much bigger than the final level in the mod. One of the major changes in there is in the original mod, the whole side of the cliff face was covered in painting and writing, and a lot of that moved inside to that corridor in the caves where it's really obsessionally painted on. And it was really, we spent so long on that because we were trying to get it looking right, because it's one of those really interesting examples where I loved the image and the idea that you've got this guy painting the entire side of a mountain with words and symbols and things. But it was really interesting when it went into the rebuild, it just never worked. And I think it was because the environment was so crude in the mod that those symbols and that painting became the focus of the level, and it changed the feeling of the level completely, when actually that just wasn't something we could realise in any way, that not even technically but just didn't artistically look and feel right. And I think probably sort of retrospectively looking back on it, that's about the sort of the sophistication and the subtlety that then came into the art, rather than just being, this is literally just a canvas that we write words on, to actually the environment telling its own story without the story being literally painted on it.
Yeah, it was very difficult when we were experimenting with that to kind of like make it not completely unreal. Like, I think for me it was kind of, I wanted to kind of bring the player a little bit back into reality after the caves, and I think with having those symbols everywhere, it was kind of pushing them out a little bit. So I think what we came to, the kind of compromise we had, it was kind of a nice in between.
Yeah, it didn't feel like a compromise to me. It felt
really?
like, no, it felt like it didn't work, but it kind of, but those symbols were coded. Like there's the hill in the background when you're standing right at the end of the boat and you look back, and you suddenly realise that the shape of the mountain is the shape of a woman lying on her side asleep. And that, I remember seeing it for the first time around and going, it's saying the same things, but it's saying it in a much subtler way than in the initial layer. But it was definitely challenging going back to how do you have a deep, complicated, subtle art style, but still manage to have something which is very sort of stark and symbolic laid over the top. It was much more challenging.
Ouais, tu m'étonnes.
I think one of the most fascinating things for me about planning this director's commentary has been that in previous years, when all the three of us have talked about Dear Esther, we've talked about the interpretation of the player, but actually going through this together, post having made it, we're still surprising each other.
Yeah,
and I think that's really, really interesting for me, because it shows that we left interpretation for each other, and that we trusted each other actually just to get on with it. And because we each brought our own special and unique contribution to the game, we didn't have to, in a way, talk it to death or say, you have to justify every idea you have or talk it to death or explain it. That Rob's idea that the island is very tainted and corrupt, and my idea that Dan didn't know that the whole level of the caves is a birth metaphor. I think it's really amazing that we're still finding out things about the game that we didn't know.
I think it was nice when I came onto it, because Dan was basically like, he gave me a bunch of materials, but he left me to my own devices for a lot of it, and we kind of like, I'd finish the level and Dan would play it and give me some feedback, but he was very kind of like hands off at the beginning, which was really nice, kind of. So a lot of my interpretations just came through that downtime where I was just kind of like going off and doing my own thing. And so yeah, it's like interesting to hear Dan talk about it sometimes, because there's some backstory that I've never even considered before. And obviously hearing Jess talk about it as well is really interesting, especially when it comes to the soundtrack. It makes me look at things in a very different way. So yeah, it's really interesting.
I think for me, like making games is so inherently collaborative, and you have people coming together with different ideas and different takes on things. And in a way, the least interesting thing you can do with that is to structure it all so heavily that there's no space for each individual person to bring what they're thinking to it. And I think the best games, well, for me, my favourite games are ones where you can really feel the personal footprint of each individual developer and aspects of it, and it feels like it has been a genuinely collaborative exercise where everybody has thrown ideas into the mix and everybody is bringing something to the table rather than people are just following a kind of a really structured plan. So yeah, I think it probably is one of the reasons why Esther has had the sort of life it's had since release, is because there's 4 people if you include Nigel, all bringing very different things to it, and it gives it a huge amount of depth for something that's so simple on the surface.
Ah, le jeu vidéo. Alors oui, du coup, on a eu le trophée pour les urnes là-bas. Voilà, donc je voulais pas couper pendant qu'ils étaient en train de faire leur discours. Nous avons également du coup ce fantôme qui est ici, qui ne part pas, hein, on peut se rapprocher au maximum. Voilà, je voulais vous le montrer, voilà, je voulais en profiter. Donc on a ce commentaire là.
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the 3 games that you've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
I think I'm really interested in people and the stories that make up people. And I think there is like in the Bible, like most kind of religious texts, it's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is, and that's what you're really getting towards, the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor. And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and transformation and who you really are and what that means. And it felt like just a really strong, powerful way of making it very accessible, the narrator's kind of inner turmoil, in a kind of a story that we know really well. And there's a universality to those kind of questions that, you know, whether it's, you know, Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's kind of Buddhism, that they're asking very broadly similar questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a good person? How should we behave to each other? How should we feel about the world we're in? And it's a really powerful way of speaking to a lot of people. I think that's always been really important as well, is that it's about saying no matter who you are or what your kind of like outlook on life is, whether that's, you know, faith-based or secular, that we are all effectively asking the same questions. And that's why I think all our games kind of tend to be around those questions.
Alors j'ai rien écouté, je suis désolé parce qu'en fait, il y a 2 escaliers. Et apparemment, l'escalier que j'avais vu tout à l'heure n'est pas celui que je crois. Donc en fait, c'est celui qu'on voit tout au bout là-bas. Mais non, non, je pense que je me suis pas trompé. Parce qu'en fait, il me parle d'un sentier à flanc de falaise. Alors à flanc, ça veut dire qu'il grimpe la falaise. Sur le bord. Il y en a un là. Donc on en a un autre là-bas. De toute façon, oui, maintenant, tant qu'on est sur la fin en soi.
So, Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about walking simulator?
You know what, I think I took offense to it when it first became a thing, but you know, I think actually I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games that kind of embraced it. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative industry, and I think it shows that games have a long way to come in terms of how we describe an experience. So I do agree with Rob that it's really positive that we reclaimed Walking Simulator, but I still find it reductive, possibly, as a term. What about you, Dan?
I think for me, it's people want to know what they're buying and what they're getting into, and I think it's so people understand what a walking simulator is.
Putain, je me suis dit je vole.
First adventure or slow moving, not very interactive story.
C'est pas normal ça.
Really very fluffy, but I think if you buy a game and someone says it's a walking simulator now, you've
Gnome.
got a pretty
Eh,
good idea what you're getting.
vous l'avez dit.
You know, there's Gone Home, Firewatch, Stanley
Stanley
Parable,
Parable ou
some
Firewatch,
really
j'en ai
good
entendu
titles
parler, je
that
les ai jamais fait.
kind of fall within that group of
Peut-être un
games
jour.
out there now, that it does have an identity, and I think that's the really good thing about it. I mean, when Esther came out, there was literally nothing. We had no idea how we described it or what we
No,
called
we
it.
actually struggled with that quite a lot when it came to
Yeah, and
marketing
sort of
as
ended up
well.
being sort of like a ghost story because it felt like it was the closest thing we could get. But it feels like now you can make a game like this and you can say it's a walking simulator, and people will know what it is straight away.
Yeah, I think that's the nice thing is there's a whole group of games out there now that quite comfortably put themselves into that category, and so it's like if we were to come out before and just said it's a walking simulator, people would have been like, well, that sounds terribly boring. That doesn't. Why the hell would I play that? But now people kind of are a little
Seek
bit.
them
Oh,
out.
fais chier.
Yeah, now people are kind of familiar with what that means. The people out there who actually seek this sort of stuff out, and it's kind of really cool. I mean, me myself, I would actually do that, use that as a term to search. But yeah, I mean, it's a very simplified term for what our game is, and there's obviously a lot more to it than walking. But I think when you look at other genres, they're also kind of very simplified. You know, first-person shooter, role-playing game. It's to me, it doesn't seem as bad as any of those other things.
Voilà. Du coup, je voulais faire celui-là et après on va aller tout là-bas, essayer de monter dans le sentier.
Is
Si
there
ça
a
mène vers la fin du
difference?
jeu, on refera en arrière et on reviendra ici. Mais si c'est un
a mix
cul-de-sac,
of
autant y aller
both,
direct.
really. I think, like my interpretation is kind of like I always feel like kind of depressed when I think about the kind of turmoil that this guy's been going through for God knows how long, and the kind of environment he's been in, and you know all these events surrounding his story. But for me, I always feel like a little bit hopeful at the end. You know, like the conclusion just feels like a relief.
Ouais, je crois que je suis en train de rattraper justement. Ouais, là-bas, j'aurais dû y aller dès le début, je pense.
What do you think, Jess?
I think it's a game about acceptance.
Si je me trompe pas.
And I really like that. And I think it's telling that a lot of people with mental health issues have responded really positively to the game, and then we get a lot of emails and letters from those people saying that it's helped them through a really difficult time. And for me, that's because it's about the struggle of being human, that it's hard and that we love and that we grieve and we lose, but we come through it. And those things are what makes us human, that it's transformative and that the pain is part of life. And that's a really beautiful message. And I think that's what you do so well, Dan. That's what you write about. You write about what it is to be human. So, Dan, you wrote it.
Without wanting to cop out, one of the things about writing it that I really wanted to do was to make something that people could take and could own, and it would be their take on it, and that their interpretation of it mattered in a way that mine didn't. My job was to give them the architecture to interpret in their way. So
I think that is a cop
C'est bon,
out.
j'ai rattrapé le
I
train.
do. I think as a
I think
writer,
it
you
is.
always have.
yeah, I think it's redemptive.
Donc
But I
effectivement,
don't
il aurait
think
mieux
redemption's
fallu
cut and
partir à,
dried, it's
4,
all
à
okay at the
droite.
end. It's not okay at the end, but there is a release, there's an escape, that bad times will happen, but they will end. And they won't always end positively, but they will end. And that's I think, the redemption of it, of saying that
This
things are never
too shall
easy.
pass.
This too shall pass.
Which my mum
yeah.
always says, you know, and I think that's probably the motto of the Chinese room,
Yeah,
actually,
absolutely.
isn't it?
Like, I don't think it's as kind of openly positive as, say, Rapture had a much more strongly positive end. I don't think Esther has. I think it's much grayer than that. But I think fundamentally it's about...
Irius Gun tout de Rapture se termine d'une façon bien plus puissante et positive. Pas tant que ça, hein.
One of the really nice things
On soit
about
sincère, hein,
moving from mod to the commercial version is that we had
Merde, je fais comment pour y
a
aller?
couple of years worth of the
Par là?
community talking about the game before we went back into it again.
Ouais,
And
par là.
one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream of story in there. So we added in a couple of cues within the force level that intimated much more strongly that actually Paul wasn't this other character who caused the accident, but actually you were responsible for everything. But again, it was then trying to find that balance of not overcooking it, so you weren't led to that idea, but just if you happen to have the combination of just a couple of narrative units, then you would possibly come to that interpretation. But it was really amazing to be able to say, it felt like giving something back to the fans that had enabled us to make the remake in the first place. And it's always a lovely moment as a developer to be able to recognise your fan community and kind of say, thanks, this one's yours, this one's here for you.
I'd been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints, and sometimes they're to markate where an accident has taken place. So you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers and candles, and it always really touched me. And so I said to Rob, I think it would be amazing to get these into the game somehow, and then Rob took that idea and ran with it, and I think they're so successful and they're so beautiful and they're really moving, and I think it's because you had this elemental scale, you have the island and it's huge and you have that scale and all of a sudden you come around this corner and it's absolutely brought back to the human scale again and to that relationship of the individual. And I think the other thing that it does really successfully is it's a kind of magic realism, because there's no way that you could have all those amounts of candles lighting your way. Who's lit them? The island is empty. Who's put those shrines there? But I just think it's a really lovely bit of environmental storytelling, actually.
C'est long, hein. En fait, le truc, c'est que maintenant, on revient là, on remonte. Il y a un moment, on va faire un stop. On a la moitié du chapitre, hein, pour ceux qui se posent la question. En fait, il fallait par là. Ah, je crois que je vais être condamné à réécouter celui-là. C'est ma faute.
So, Dear Esther is the first
On
walking
n'attendra pas
simulator.
pour
How do you feel about Walking Simulator?
choper l'autre.
You know what, I think I took offense to it when it first,
Là, 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 là.
but
Sur la gauche, on va avoir du coup des rails.
much now. I think the fact that
Je pense des rails de train, parce que les rails de coke, ça risque d'être plutôt compliqué. Alors, j'en vois, enfin, je vois le commentaire, et apparemment, ce serait sur notre gauche. Ce ne sont pas des rails. Ils sont là.
I'm still really confused
I'm
about
feeling
the need
lonely.
to categorise in games. Probably
Oh,
more
I
than
wish
any
I
other
could have found a
creative
lover
industry,
that
and I
can
think it
hold
shows
me.
that games have a long way to
Now
come
I'm
in terms
crying
of
in my
how
room,
we describe
so
an
skeptical of
experience.
love.
I
Tu,
do agree with Rob that it's really positive that we
na,
reclaimed
na, na,
Walking
mo,
Simulator, but I still
mo,
find
mo.
it reductive,
Ouais, trop
possibly,
cool, il y a
as a
des...
term. What about you,
Qu'est-ce que je suis
Dan?
en train
I
de
think
faire?
for me, it's
Il y a
it's people
des
well aware what they're buying, what they're getting into.
des
And I
personnes
think
qui
it's
regardaient
so
mon
people
tweet
understand what a walking simulator is now. In a
que
way,
j'avais
it
fait
feels like
pour
first-person
Petit
adventure,
Miller.
slow moving, not very interactive, story-driven games. They're all sort of really very fluffy.
J'aime bien
But
like.
I think if you
Dark Shark.
buy a game and someone says
Okay.
it's a walking simulator now, you've got.
I'm feeling lonely.
He's gone home.
Oh, I wish I could have found a lover that can hold me. Now I'm crying in my room.
Quite a lot bigger than the original mod, and it's also the one where actually the movement
On
around
est
it
au
is
numéro
the
9.
most artificial. There's the big zigzagging cliff paths that basically it's like a series of straight lines from point to point. There isn't a lot of movement, and one of the things that was really difficult to do with that was to not make it feel too much like a corridor and to give it that sort of sense of space and that you were actually exploring somewhere quite natural. I think, Rob, there was stuff which you put in there, like little new beat moments, like the ruins at the edge of the cliff, that just helped the player feel like they were on a journey rather than being pushed through a pipe.
Yeah, it was kind of just giving the player the reward for continuing on, and it, you know, kind of still giving them some aspect of exploration and things to discover. I mean, the journey in this one is mostly vertical, but in the spaces where you are going horizontally, you know, there's at least in the original mod there wasn't a lot to see or do. So I just tried like layering in some very subtle things that didn't necessarily add huge arcs to the story, but just kind of added little questions more than anything else. Like I added the dock there with at the end. There's lots of little bits and pieces that have kind of been layered in to really just make it a lot more of an interesting place despite the size.
Nous avons les fantômes.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple,
C'est vrai qu'il y a un fantôme là aussi.
exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really means that every aspect of it has to be produced at a really high quality and has to be done with a lot of passion and a lot of thought. There's nowhere to hide in a game like Esther, and that's something which I think carries through to the best games of this type. You can see with all of them there's a real commitment to kind of depth and a really intelligent way of approaching design, and a real kind of trust in the player and a real assumption that players are smart, imaginative people who want experiences. It's not a game that it's easy to just knock off or to do with any kind of lazy attitude. You have to be really, really passionate and care a great deal and put an awful lot of thought into it if it's going to work.
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game.
Fantômes.
Like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you'll see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face, and these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well.
Non, c'était pour faire disparaître l'ombre.
Beyond this world, something kind of unsettling, and yeah, we've a lot of effort's been put in to make these things very subtle. I didn't really want them to be like, I didn't want it to be a ghost story, so to speak, but I just kind of wanted to bring some of this supernatural element into the game, and this area is probably one of the most prominent because you can see it just before you
Oui, c'est le fantôme le plus flagrant. Bah, je vous ai montré
gully here.
2-3, donc...
And I think it's really one of my favorite scenes,
Donc,
just
ouais.
because of it being so spooky, so unreal, and so
C'est cool.
interesting.
Je trouve ça vraiment super cool cet ajout,
The
honnêtement.
overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb. And you know it's that pause before you're going to start the final climb and before the game's kind of builds to a climax. But you can also see the whole level, and it's like the idea that you are standing looking down on your own journey, a bit like the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, or sort of like seeing your body but having an out-of-body experience at the moment of death. And it was really designed to try and get that feeling as the player that you stop and you take stock of everything, and there's a bit of a sense of there's no going back. You take a breath and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense, and I think we did. I think it really came together here, that you got that sense of going, right, now this ends and now I move forwards to it.
So here it kind of the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colors a little bit.
C'est vrai
bring
que
the saturation is kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more cave-like aesthetics in terms of colors and stuff like that. And it's kind of there to kind of signpost another significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious. And some of that emotional stuff comes through just through the colors of the environment, and the more saturated they are, the more kind of surreal things become. So this is kind of like a turning point in the game. It's kind of like the final notice of you reaching the end.
Ils ont fait 600 avertissements comme quoi on arrive à la fin du jeu, hein, sur les écoutes. Moi, je trouve ça assez drôle.
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and, yeah, full-bodied. And then one of the string players said to me, this is wrong actually for what we're playing. And they said, let's strip out all the vibrato, let's play it in a really Scottish, plain style. And it absolutely transformed that piece, and it's one of the really special things about being a composer, is that you get to collaborate with people who come fresh to it. So you have this preconceived idea of how it should be, and then they say, no, why don't we turn it around and think about it like this? And it absolutely fits and works for that scene, because what we're getting at this point is a sense of fragility, of an ending, and it's almost reminiscent of a funeral procession. It's slow and it's dirge-like, but yeah, it was just a lovely moment where they gave something of themselves, and that's what's amazing about working with live instrumentalists. You're never going to get that from a sample.
Bah forcément, parce que quand tu fais qu'un sample, t'es toute seule, Lucette.
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right. Quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end and that this is it. And that unlike where the rest of the island, there's this sense of this could just keep going on forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep the motif of come back. But I think when you set on this path, we really wanted to have that sense of this is it, this is the last time you're going to walk these paths, this will end now. And that sort of idea of going, you're kind of climbing towards your death, but you're also moving towards a point where that glimpse in the caves where you see the motorway and you go, I understand what this is about. For me, the whole path up the side of the mountain is about saying, it's okay. It's that kind of starting to kind of release it and go, it's kind of okay that Esther died. It's kind of okay that the accident happened. I know that I'm going to die. I know that this is going to end. And I know that there's nowhere for me to go apart from follow this path, but that's all right. And it was very sort of hard
That's
kind
all
of
right.
find that subtle mix between the dread of it and the acceptance. It's where the positive and the negative and the kind of the loss and the redemption really start colliding for me. At least certainly that was what we were trying to achieve with it.
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that went into kind of building up this feeling of tension as you're rising and kind of making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into building up this weather.
J'ai envie de lui dire cours.
And the swaying of the grass and kind of
Parce que ça fait pom 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 pom.
Visually really trying to make this a tense moment, and I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return, and that's been very deliberately designed that way.
Bon, et ben voilà, le dernier commentaire. Voilà, le dernier fantôme. Il y en a d'autres hein, qu'on n'a pas vu, mais... on a juste une ombre. C'est... Voilà, je ne parle pas volontairement. Garder un petit peu l'attention du jeu. Mine de rien.
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or whether it was okay to go to a cutscene at this point. I personally don't mind it. I actually actively like it because I think it works really well as a metaphor for loss of control at that point. Dan, I know you're not as keen.
Yeah, I'm not. I would have loved the player not to have had control taken away from them, but to me it was a kind of it was a balance between two evils. The evil of having a cutscene and the evil of the player accidentally falling off the ladder halfway up and destroying the ending.
I agree. Like I think we tried a few different things, and the tech at the time just wasn't, the ladder tech at the time just wasn't there. So, and the other thing for me was pacing. It was making sure all the music, the voiceovers, the timings and everything were perfect for that final jump off point, and just letting the players kind of noodle around going up a ladder for what may have been like 7 minutes because it's a tall tower was kind of an impossible task.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most on working on Dear Esther was Rob's beautiful visuals were so inspiring, but Dan's words are always so amazing to write to. I think that's where we start as a partnership. And the music at the end was so easy to write because that last voiceover is the pinnacle of the writing to me, as it should be, because it's the last VO, so you would have failed if it wasn't good, but it is just so beautiful and moving. And for me, talking about whether it's a hopeful ending, the music is really hopeful at this point, and it signifies to me transformation, freedom, escape, acceptance. Yeah, and it was just a beautiful cue to write, actually.
I don't know, I can't remember quite where it came from in the mod, but the moment when we went, or we could put the bird in there, and you could see the bird's shadow, and actually it turned from being kind of like a straightforward literal suicide into a metaphorical, or to my mind, kind of like, I always really believed the narrator did turn into a bird just before they hit the ground, and that was really important. I think it's probably the strongest ending in any of our games so far. But yeah, I'm very proud of the way everything came together in that last section.
Yeah, I think it's the bird thing is particularly interesting because I think it was in the original mod, but the timings and everything were just all off, and you never really saw the seagull. Yeah, at least the shadow as well. It was all kind of like a little bit broken. And I remember when we went back in, I made a real effort to try and get that shadow just out of the center of the view, so you kind of have this hint of something happening, and I think you can hear the sound of a seagull flapping its wings. It's like very subtle, but like I say, I kind of really like the way that came together. It kind of it's very like say it's kind of like a release, but at the same time there's still this kind of ambiguity there that's kind of beautiful.
And I'm really proud that I got the monitor in at the end for ending of, it goes into
Bon, ça par contre, c'est très film. Hein.
Hospital monitor signifying the flat line, and I think it's a really...
C'est très très film, le moniteur cardiaque.
It's one
Hein.
of those moments where it's so clever that people notice it and it takes them out of the moment, but it just flows in through the music and it just feels like everything comes together at that.
C'est vrai que je l'ai même pas remarqué.
That last
C'est vrai, ça se remarque pas tant que ça. Ça distille bien.
Yeah, it feels like a really, really strong and beautiful ending.
And then in the last
C'est vrai que la fin de Esther est très bien.
Nigel Carrington
Mais il faut avoir fait le jeu quelques fois, quoi.
Where he just pitch perfect.
Yeah. So that's the end of the director's commentary. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've uncovered some secrets and some facts that you didn't know about the game before.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you for buying the game and for all our fans who've been behind us and been behind the game and have kept it alive all these years. It's a real privilege that it's still out there, still such a title that people love so much.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to the future and what we can create coming up next. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Ah là 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 là. For the Chinese Room. Tac, donc voilà, mesdames et messieurs. Fin de la première run de Esther. Si on reprend notre liste de trophées à avoir, il nous en manque encore 2. Tac. Voilà. Le premier étant... on peut regarder... là de dingue. On en a eu 2. C'est ça, il nous en manque 2. Il nous manque marcher 5000 pas et débloquer toutes les voix du narrateur. Ça, on fera ça demain. Du coup, évidemment... ouais, c'était bien Valve. Donc effectivement, Valve, c'est peut-être sans doute pour Half-Life 2, du coup. Vu qu'ils avaient fait... que c'était un mode, quoi. Hop. Moi, j'aime bien des Esther. Pour ça, je suis très content de vous le proposer à 100% en stream. Pas en une fois, hein, du coup, j'avais le doute. Est-ce que je pouvais le faire en une fois? Non. Non, hein. Surtout en plus que mine de rien, les commentaires, ils prennent un peu leur temps pour discuter quand même, hein. Ils discutent un peu. Il y en a 16 et 14, 30 et 14, 44. On a 69 commentaires de développeurs. Par contre, les vous. Ah, par contre, ouais, j'avoue, demain, les voix, ça risque d'être assez rapide aussi, hein. Parce que les voix, on en a 20. Alors, 21, 25 et 35 voix. Plus le fait d'avoir les 100 pas. Aïe, 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 aïe. Mais bon, nous verrons ça demain. J'ai un petit peu mal au ventre, du coup, je vais devoir faire un petit peu une fin express, si je peux dire. Donc, voilà. Mesdames et messieurs, merci beaucoup d'avoir suivi ce stream. Je vais quitter pour des raisons biologiques. Voilà. Et j'espère que ce let's play ce let's play il n'est pas fini, hein, il reste encore un stream, hein, vous en faites pas, il reste encore un stream. Je vous invite à regarder l'épisode fait en 2021, d'une heure, où on a fait tout le jeu. L'épisode date un petit peu, donc voilà. Donc si vous avez pu profiter aujourd'hui de refaire le jeu un petit peu, même si on n'avait pas le narrateur, on l'aura demain, avec moi. Moi, ça m'a fait plaisir en tout cas. Même si il y a des moments où j'ai pas beaucoup écouté, mais c'était quand même très cool. Allez, je vous fais des bisous, je vous mets 3 minutes de pub et je vous embrasse. Voilà, gros bisous. Pourquoi avoir besoin d'une fin compliquée?